Every single year, roughly 90,000 ships pass through a stretch of water so narrow that in some places you could almost shout across it. It connects two oceans, it carries nearly a quarter of all global trade, it moves oil that powers factories in China, electronics bound for Europe, and food that feeds half of Southeast Asia. This is the Strait of Malacca. And here's the thing that most people don't realize. It doesn't belong to any one country. It belongs to three. Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia all share sovereignty over this waterway. Each of them has their own interests, their own priorities, their own version of what this strait should be used for and how it should be controlled. And they almost never fully agree. This is the story of one of the most important strips of water on Earth, the three nations who claim it, and why managing it has been one of the most complicated geopolitical puzzles in the modern world. To understand why three countries are in a constant low-level argument about this waterway, you first need to understand just how irreplaceable it is. The Strait of Malacca sits between the Malay Peninsula on one side and the Indonesian island of Sumatra on the other. At its widest point, it is about 250 miles across. At its narrowest, near the city of Singapore at the southern end, it squeezes down to just 1.7 miles of navigable water. That is almost impossibly thin for a waterway of such global importance. Think about what has to fit through that gap. Oil tankers from the Persian Gulf heading to China, Japan, and South Korea. Container ships loaded with electronics, clothing, and machinery moving between Asia and Europe. Liquefied natural gas carriers, bulk carriers full of coal and iron ore, military vessels, fishing boats, ferries. Day after day, year after year, a constant river of ships threading through this narrow passage. According to data from recent years, roughly 40% of global trade passes through the Strait of Malacca. Some estimates put it even higher. China alone sends about 80% of its oil imports through this strait. Japan and South Korea are similarly dependent on it. If this strait were closed for even a few weeks, it would trigger an economic crisis across Asia and ripple outward to the rest of the world. The alternative routes are all terrible. Ships could go around the southern tip of Australia, but that adds weeks to any journey. They could use the Lombok Strait or the Sunda Strait, both of which run through Indonesian waters, but those are deeper and less predictable, and the infrastructure to support them does not exist at anywhere near the necessary scale. So the Strait of Malacca is not just important, it is essentially irreplaceable in the short to medium term. And that means whoever controls it or shares control of it holds enormous leverage over the global economy. Now here's where the complication begins. Under international maritime law, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea or UNCLOS, the Strait of Malacca is an international strait used for navigation. Ships have the right of transit passage through it. No country can simply block it or change tolls for passing through. But sovereignty over the waters and the seabed is another matter. Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia all have territorial waters that overlap with the strait. That means all three have a say in how it is managed, how it is policed, and who bears the cost of keeping it safe. And each of those three countries has very different interests. Let us start with Singapore. Singapore is a city-state of about 6 million people sitting at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula. It has almost no natural resources. What it has is location. Singapore's entire economic model is built on being the world's busiest transshipment port. Ships come from everywhere, unload cargo, and reload cargo that gets sent elsewhere. The port of Singapore handles over 600 million tons of cargo per year. It is one of the top 2 or 3 ports in the entire world by almost every measure. For Singapore, a smooth, open, well-functioning Strait of Malacca is not just good policy, it is existential. If the strait becomes dangerous, unreliable, or politically contested, ships will avoid it. If ships avoid it, they stop calling at Singapore. And if they stop calling at Singapore, the country's economic reason for existing is threatened. So Singapore is always pushing for maximum freedom of navigation, deep international cooperation, strong anti-piracy measures, and as little friction for shipping traffic as possible. It wants the strait to be as close to an international highway as it can be. It is deeply uncomfortable with any move that might let individual countries assert too much control over transit. Now look at Malaysia. Malaysia has a much more complicated relationship with this strait. It shares a long coastline with it. Malaysian fishing communities depend on the waters near the strait for their livelihoods. Malaysian ports like Port Klang and Penang benefit from shipping traffic. The country earns revenue from bunkering, which is the refueling of ships, and from maritime services. But Malaysia also has concerns that Singapore does not. It worries about environmental damage from the constant parade of tankers. It worries about accidents and oil spills. It is sensitive about sovereignty, about the idea that its territorial waters could be used as a highway by foreign powers with no real say from Kuala Lumpur. And historically, Malaysia has been more cautious than Singapore about the presence of large foreign naval forces in the strait, particularly from countries like the United States and China. Malaysia tends to want a balance. Yes, keep the strait open and free for navigation, but give the littoral states, meaning the countries that actually border it, more real authority over what happens there, more say in enforcement, more compensation for the environmental and security costs they bear. And then there is Indonesia. Indonesia's relationship with the Strait of Malacca is the most complicated of the three. Indonesia is a massive archipelagic nation of over 270 million people with more than 17,000 islands stretching across Southeast Asia. The northern coast of Sumatra runs along the western side of the strait, but Jakarta, Indonesia's capital, is far away. The strait is not the center of Indonesian economic life the way it is for Singapore. Indonesia is fiercely protective of its sovereignty. It has historically been among the most vocal advocates for the rights of coastal states over international waters near their shores. In the past, Indonesia argued that the Strait of Malacca should be treated more like an internal waterway than an international one, which would give the three bordering countries far more control over who could pass through and under what conditions. That position has softened over the decades under international pressure and the practical realities of global trade. Indonesia eventually signed on to UNCLOS and accepted the transit passage regime. But the underlying instinct, the desire to have real sovereignty and real control over the waters near its shores, has never fully gone away. Indonesia also has domestic political considerations. Separatist movements in Aceh, the region at the northern tip of Sumatra closest to the strait, have flared up at various points in history. The strait is a channel through which weapons, money, and people can move. Jakarta wants the ability to police it effectively. So you have three countries with three different sets of priorities sitting around the same body of water. Singapore wants openness, Malaysia wants balance and recognition, Indonesia wants sovereignty and security. They all benefit from the strait functioning well, but they have fundamentally different visions of what good management looks like. These tensions are not new, they go back decades. In the early years after Malaysian independence in 1957 and Indonesian independence in 1945, neither country had given much formal thought to how the strait would be managed. It was simply there, and ships used it, and the colonial era understandings mostly held. The first major flashpoint came in 1971 when Malaysia and Indonesia jointly announced what became known as the Kuala Lumpur Declaration. They claimed that the Strait of Malacca was not an international strait but rather under the exclusive jurisdiction of the littoral states. Singapore notably did not join this declaration. It was exactly the kind of arrangement Singapore feared most. If Malaysia and Indonesia controlled the state, they could theoretically restrict access, charge fees, or exclude navies they did not want. The international response was sharp. The major maritime powers, especially the United States, the Soviet Union, and Japan, all objected strongly. They had enormous interests in keeping the strait open. The US and Soviet navies both used it regularly during the Cold War. Japan needed it for its oil supply. The dispute helped push the international community toward the comprehensive law of the sea negotiations that would eventually produce UNCLOS, signed in 1982. The convention tried to thread the needle. Yes, the Strait of Malacca is a strait used for international navigation and transit passage rights must be respected. But the bordering states have real responsibilities and real rights regarding the management of the strait, including environmental protection and vessel traffic management. It was a compromise that satisfied nobody completely and everyone partially. The strait remained open, but exactly what the bordering states could and could not do was left with enough ambiguity that disputes have continued ever since. Piracy became the next big crisis point. Through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, the Strait of Malacca became one of the most dangerous stretches of water for piracy in the entire world. Small boats would intercept cargo ships, board them at night, rob crews, sometimes take hostages. At its peak in the early 2000s, the International Maritime Bureau was recording over 200 attacks per year in the region. This was a direct challenge to all three countries. Their inability to fully cooperate on policing the strait was letting pirates operate with relative impunity. But it was also exposing their disagreements. How should patrols be coordinated? Could one country's naval vessels operate in another's territorial waters when chasing pirates? What happened when a pirate attack occurred right on the boundary between Malaysian and Indonesian waters? The answer that eventually emerged was the Malacca Strait Patrols, a framework established in 2004 that allowed Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore to coordinate joint aerial and sea patrols. It was a genuine breakthrough in practical cooperation. Piracy rates dropped dramatically. By the late 2000s, the strait was no longer on the international piracy watch list. But even the Malacca Strait patrols carried the fingerprints of the underlying tensions. Each country still patrols its own waters. There is coordination but not full integration. Thailand eventually joined as an observer, but the original resistance to allowing foreign naval vessels to operate freely in each country's territorial waters has never been fully overcome. Fast forward to today, and the disagreements have not disappeared, they have evolved. One of the biggest ongoing tensions is about the cost of maintaining the strait. Keeping a waterway this busy, safe, and navigable is genuinely expensive. The water needs to be regularly dredged because sediment builds up. Navigation aids, buoys, lighthouses, and radar stations need to be maintained. Search and rescue infrastructure has to be on standby. Environmental monitoring has to happen constantly. Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia all contribute to this, but unevenly. Singapore, with its massive port revenues, has historically been more willing to invest. Malaysia and Indonesia have sometimes felt that they bear disproportionate environmental and social costs of the shipping traffic without receiving proportionate benefits. There have been long-running conversations about whether transit fees could be charged, with UNCLOS technically prohibits for international straits, or whether the international community and the major shipping nations should contribute more to the maintenance costs. This conversation has never been resolved cleanly. The major maritime powers resist any move that looks like it could lead to toll collection or restrictions. The bordering states continue to feel that they are subsidizing the world's shipping industry with their own resources. Environmental concerns have been increasingly prominent. The strait sees around 84,000 ship transits per year by recent counts. That is an enormous amount of fuel being burned, bilge water potentially being dumped, and risk of collision or grounding. The Nagoya Trough and the waters around the strait contain some of the richest marine biodiversity in Southeast Asia. A major oil spill in the strait would be catastrophic. In 2017, the tanker Alnic MC collided with a US Navy destroyer in the strait in an incident that highlighted just how dangerously congested these waters are. It was not the kind of environmental disaster that changes policy overnight, but it added to the accumulating case that something more needs to be done to manage traffic density. Malaysia and Indonesia have both pushed for stronger environmental regulations over vessels transiting the strait. Singapore has been more cautious, again fearing that any additional regulatory burden could push shipping traffic toward alternative routes or reduce the attractiveness of Singapore as a port of call. Then there's the question of China. China's growing naval presence in the South China Sea has added a new dimension to the Strait's politics. The South China Sea sits directly to the east of the Strait's northern entrance. China's controversial Nine-Dash Line claim, which asserts Chinese sovereignty over most of the South China Sea, puts Chinese territorial claims very close to the waters that feed into the Strait of Malacca. For Malaysia and Indonesia, this is directly threatening. Malaysia has overlapping claims with China in the South China Sea. Indonesia's exclusive economic zone around the Natuna Islands has been repeatedly encroached upon by Chinese fishing vessels and Coast Guard ships. Both countries have had confrontational incidents with Chinese maritime forces in recent years. For Singapore, the calculus is different but also complicated. Singapore has extensive economic ties with China. It has tried to maintain a balanced position between China and the United States, but it is also deeply invested in a rules-based international maritime order, which China's Nine-Dash Line claim directly undermines. The United States, for its part, conducts regular freedom of navigation operations through the South China Sea, sailing warships through waters that China claims. These operations sometimes bring US naval vessels close to or through the Strait of Malacca. Malaysia and Indonesia are genuinely uncomfortable with this, seeing it as great power rivalry playing out in their backyard. Singapore, while not endorsing the operations officially, benefits from the US commitment to keeping the sea lanes open. So the strait has become, in a subtle but real way, a theater for the broader US-China competition in Asia. And that puts the three bordering countries in difficult positions, each trying to navigate between the two great powers in ways that serve their different interests. Here is the deepest issue at the heart of the disagreement between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia over the Strait of Malacca. It is not really about piracy or environmental fees or even great power politics. Those are symptoms. The actual disease is a fundamental mismatch between global economic reality and the political framework of national sovereignty. The strait functions as a piece of global infrastructure. The whole world depends on it. The economic benefits of keeping it open and efficient flow to China, Japan, South Korea, Europe, the United States, and basically every trading nation on earth. But the costs of maintaining it, policing it, and living with its downsides fall almost entirely on three countries: Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. The International Legal Framework, UNCLOS, says that the strait is open for international navigation and the bordering states cannot restrict it. But it does not create a compelling mechanism for the rest of the world to share the maintenance burden. The major maritime powers get most of the benefit and bear almost none of the cost. Within that frustrating framework, the three bordering states have different positions based on their sizes, their economies, and their historical experiences. Singapore is tiny and rich and depends on the strait being open, so it aligns closely with the position of the major maritime powers. Keep it open, keep it free, and Singapore will prosper. Malaysia is medium-sized and has enough of an economy to be somewhat independent. It wants recognition of its costs and its sovereign interests. But it also cannot afford to disrupt the state because Port Klang and Malaysian exporters need the shipping lanes too. Indonesia is large and proud and has deep historical anxieties about foreign powers operating in its backyard. It wants sovereignty to mean something real, but it also needs foreign investment and trade access, which depend on being seen as a responsible partner in managing the strait. None of these positions is wrong. All three countries have legitimate interests, but those interests push in different directions, and there is no supranational authority that can override any of them. The Malacca Strait Council, the various bilateral treaties, the joint patrols, all of these are genuine achievements. They show that the three countries can cooperate when the stakes are high enough, but they are essentially workarounds. They work around the fundamental tension rather than resolving it. As long as national sovereignty is the organizing principle of international relations, and it is likely to remain so for the foreseeable future, the Strait of Malacca will be managed by three countries that agree on the basics but disagree on almost everything else. It is worth spending a moment imagining what actually happens if cooperation in the strait fails badly. The nightmare scenario is not a war between the three bordering states. That is vanishingly unlikely. Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia are all members of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is built around the principle of resolving disputes peacefully. They have economic ties, cultural connections, and decades of diplomacy linking them. They're not going to fight over the strait. The more realistic nightmare is a gradual breakdown of cooperation that allows problems to fester. Piracy could come back if the joint patrol framework weakens. Environmental damage could accumulate if monitoring and enforcement become contested. A major accident, a collision, a grounding, an oil spill could trigger a diplomatic crisis if the three countries cannot agree on who is responsible and who pays. Or more subtly, the rivalry between the United States and China could force each of the three bordering states to choose sides in ways that make cooperation harder. If Malaysia leans toward China and Singapore leans toward the US and Indonesia tries to stay neutral, coordinating on anything becomes enormously more difficult. The economic consequences of even a partial breakdown would be severe. Insurance rates for ships transiting the strait would rise, some cargo might be rerouted, port traffic at Singapore could decline, Malaysian and Indonesian fishing communities would suffer from increased military activity or environmental damage. And further out, the countries that depend most on the strait, China, Japan, South Korea, would face energy insecurity and supply chain disruption. For China in particular, which imports the vast majority of its oil through the strait, any threat to the waterway is a national security issue. This is actually one of the major drivers behind China's broader naval expansion. It is trying to develop the capability to protect its sea lanes or find alternatives to them. The irony is that the more powerful China becomes at sea, the more uncomfortable Malaysia and Indonesia become with the Chinese presence near the strait, which reinforces those countries' sense that they need to assert their own sovereignty more forcefully, which is exactly what makes coordination harder. Here's the thing though, despite all of this, the Strait of Malacca works. Piracy is down, navigation is managed, ships flow through in extraordinary numbers with a remarkably low accident rate given the traffic density. The three countries have managed to build enough practical cooperation to keep the strait functioning as the world needs it to function. That is not a small achievement, it is the product of decades of difficult diplomacy, pragmatic compromise, and a shared recognition that however much Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia disagree on the details, they all lose if the strait stops working. The joint aerial patrols called Eyes in the Sky, the coordinated sea patrols, the traffic separation schemes that organize ship movement, the mandatory ship reporting system, the cooperation on environmental protection, all of these represent real progress by three countries that have very different political traditions and interests. Singapore has contributed its technical expertise and financial resources. Malaysia has contributed its coastline and its political willingness to host regional meetings and help build consensus within ASEAN. Indonesia has contributed its territorial waters and its gradual, if sometimes grudging, acceptance of the international transit regime. The framework is imperfect. The disagreements are real. The underlying tensions have not been resolved, but the Strait of Malacca remains one of the most carefully managed international waterways in the world, precisely because all three bordering countries understand what is at stake if they get it wrong. The strait is narrow, but the task of managing it has required an enormous breadth of diplomacy. So why do they always disagree? Because they are three different countries with three different histories, three different economic situations, and three different visions of what sovereignty means in a world where global trade has made some places so strategically important that no single nation can really control them. Singapore needs the strait open because it is Singapore's reason for existing. Malaysia needs the strait respected because Malaysia's people live on its shores. Indonesia needs the strait controlled because Indonesia's identity is built on on the principle that its territory is its own. Those three things are not incompatible, but fitting them together requires constant negotiation, constant compromise, and a constant willingness to prioritize the practical over the ideological. The Strait of Malacca is not just a waterway, it is a test of whether nations can manage shared global resources without the ability to impose solutions on one another. And the fact that it keeps working imperfectly, expensively, and with ongoing argument is actually a story about how international cooperation sometimes muddles through even when the structural problems never fully get solved. The ships keep moving, the trade keeps flowing, the three countries keep arguing. And somehow that is enough. Now, if you wanna know that whole Malaysia depends on the Strait of Malacca and China wants to steal it, then you can watch this video showing up on your screen. Thanks for watching, mate, and a bundle of thanks for hitting the subscribe button. Bye.